Good afternoon. Welcome to the Korea Society and welcome to the kickoff of our fall policy season and the kickoff of a special series called The Analyst, which is designed to bring some of the senior-most minds on Korea to the Korea Society over the course of this coming semester. We look forward to seeing you back for that series. And to kick off that series is Nicholas Eberstadt, who's the Henry Wendt Chair at the American Enterprise Institute. Nick is by far one of the most prolific analysts of peninsular issues, and in particular the situation in North Korea. And he has done that for a tremendously long time. We met 20 years ago, and Nick was doing groundbreaking research then, and he continues to this day. Thank you. Thank you, Nick, for making the effort to come up from Washington and spend some time with us here in this hour with our guests from international organizations, from business, and from the area media. Understanding economic failure in the DPRK as part of our kickoff on uncovering North Korea. Would you like to say a few words to lead us off?
Thank you very much for inviting me, ladies and gents. Thank you very much for coming. I'm going to, this is kind of a test drive of some new homework that I'm doing. I have been trying to study the DPRK for a long, long time, for better part of my life. One of the things which is always a problem for outsiders is trying to get quantitative data, is trying to get statistics that help put North Korea in international perspective. The main reason is because the DPRK government doesn't want to share information which would allow outsiders to make their own independent assessments. The North Korean government has never published a statistical yearbook in the entire history of the regime, which began in 1948, if that gives you some idea. So there are no easily available numbers on GNP or on national income or any of the things we take for granted from everywhere else. And so what I've tried to do is to put together numbers about North Korea from various sources, to reconstruct them, to put them into the international tableau, and then maybe to help us understand what's been going on in North Korea. That maybe North Korea isn't a special case. Maybe North Korea is part of the human family. If we put it in an international tableau, we can understand why things have gone so terribly, desperately wrong economically. After all, we all know there was a dreadful famine in North Korea in the 1990s. I think it is fair to say that North Korea is the only urbanized, literate society during peacetime to which such a thing has ever befallen. So was this a special case? Was this due to the American blockade? Was this bad rain? Was this bad luck because Soviet aid was cut off? We've heard a lot of explanations from various sources, including from North Korean sources. But if we put the DPRK in an international quantitative perspective, I think we can understand the reality of the situation a little better. So what I'm going to show you is first of all, some information on trade performance. These are called mirror statistics, taken from North Korea's trade partners, reconstructed, and then compared to other trade performance figures for other areas of the world. Then I'm going to show you some numbers about how countries grow economically and where we put North Korea into this reckoning. Then I'm going to show you some figures that suggest to me how the North Korean economy has more or less fallen off the face of the earth over the past 40 years and why that happened. And finally, how North Korea might do better if it were simply a socialist economy, much less a reform socialist economy, or better still, a post-socialist economy. Okay, so reconstructing North Korea's export and import patterns. I could tell you a great deal about how I've done that, but I will spare you this. The green line is total exports since 1960. The blue line is total imports. You'll see there have always been more imports than exports. The strange thing is that even though this is not adjusted for inflation, North Korea's import and export levels at the end of the Cold War were higher than they were during almost the subsequent 20 years. It's only in the more recent years, only the last few years, that North Korea has exceeded its previous import and export totals. That's very bad. Things look even worse if you try to make an adjustment for inflation. The red line is North Korean exports corrected for inflation. And even though it looks as if exports have been going up in recent years, in inflation-adjusted terms, North Korea isn't back to the 1980s. It's not even back to the 1970s. And the same is true if you look at per capita imports adjusted for inflation. North Korea's inflation-adjusted per capita import level is lower than it was in the early 90s. It's lower than it was in the early 80s. It's even lower than it was in the 70s. There's been, 40 years of solitude, or whatever Gabriel Garcia Marquez said. So let's put North Korea into international perspective now. Let's look at some other countries which we know are economic failures. Argentina has just distinguished itself again by getting some quality time with itself in the world economy. Zimbabwe, a long-time underperformer. Haiti, another tragedy story. What I'm showing up here is the percentage of total world imports that the blue line, Argentina, that the green line, Zimbabwe, that the red line, Haiti, and the purple line, North Korea, seem to account for over time. And you can see that for all of these countries, this is a logarithmic scale, so when you're going down, you're really going down. You can see that there's been a long-term decline for all of these countries, but North Korea's is one of the most severe. And just to make the comparison a little bit more acute, I show here the share of world exports accounted for by Zimbabwe and accounted for by North Korea. And you'll see that the performance of these two countries over time is dismally, dismally similar. And it's not something that simply started at the end of the Cold War. This is something that North Korea has been in decline by this measure in relation to the rest of the world economy for a very long time. One other way to indicate how badly North Korea is underperforming in the world economy, I compare imports per capita for various countries around the world in 2010 with the years of schooling for their adult population. For all the other countries, I took this from a Harvard and Korea University data set. For North Korea, I take this from the 2008 DPRK census, and I did those numbers myself. North Korea is a little red dot down there. You see that? You see how far below the rest of the world North Korea's performance is? At its level of trade performance, North Korea should be over here with the countries that have 5 or 4 or 3 years of schooling on average for adults. It's almost impossible to see a country with North Korea's apparent educational profile doing as badly in international markets as North Korea is doing today. And that bad performance is a long-term trend we've just seen. Well, I'm going to skip over the econometric torture portion of the program and just show you some pictures. What I've done here is look at international patterns of development through big international data sets. World Bank, the Harvard data set I mentioned, indices of economic freedom produced by the Fraser Institute or by, on the other hand, Wall Street Journal and the Heritage Foundation. Doesn't matter which one of those you use. You can see that the predicted and actual value of per capita income around the world over this long period of time, since 1970, is pretty well predicted by 4 factors. By a country's health as measured by life expectancy, its education as measured by years of schooling, its degree of social complexity as measured by urbanization, and its institutional or business climate as measured by these economic freedom indices. And it doesn't matter which ones you use, and it doesn't matter whether you do it the same year, or if you lag the variable so that you're predicting stuff 5 years into the future, so there's no, causation problem, they all tell you the same thing. Remarkably tight story considering how untidy and messy the real world is. So we use this to look at North Korea's international patterns. We can't tell North Korean GDP because we don't know what it is. But we do know, as I said, according to its trade partners, what it's importing and exporting with respect to merchandise. So let me get to that. If you just used health, urbanization, and education to predict a country's per capita import level, you'd have something like this. North Korea is that little red dot at the bottom that's kind of fallen off the earth. But let's add business climate into it. Let's throw in this index of economic freedom, which gives a ranking for North Korea. And North Korea is right back on the chart. You see this? When you just look at human resources, North Korea is horribly underperforming. But when you add in the business climate, the index of economic freedom, North Korea is just about exactly where you'd expect it to be. And the key here is that North Korea's business climate is consistently rated to be the worst in the world. This is Zimbabwe. This is North Korea. And you'll see that both Zimbabwe and North Korea have had dips in their ratings for business climate, but it's kind of basically impossible for North Korea to get any lower today than its current rating because it would have to be negative. And they don't have negative numbers for these business climate ratings. So this shows exactly how the differences between socialist economies would be predicted, North Korea versus Vietnam versus China. The big difference here is the business climate. The business climate trumps everything. If North Korea had the same sort of business climate as Vietnam and China, it would be predicted to be doing similarly to them. As I said, if one looks over the long term, one sees a very striking situation. I'm going to show data on North Korea for trade. Okay, back in 1970, the countries that were kind of outliers for poor trade performance, given their health and human resources, were Vietnam, which is not surprising since it was in the middle of the Vietnam War. China, which is probably not surprising because that was Mao's Cultural Revolution thing. North Korea is actually much closer to the line than either China or Vietnam. North Korea is doing much better compared to those two back in 1970 than the other socialist countries. So similarly, if you look at imports, you get the same sort of thing. North Korea is much closer in 1970 than China or Vietnam, to where you'd expect them to be. And what you see, if you do this over time, from 1970 to 2010, is that gradually China is doing a better and better job of using its human resources economically. Vietnam is doing a better and better job of using its human resources economically. And North Korea is just falling off the face of the earth. This is accounted for by a worsening set of policies and institutions and practices by the North Korean government. What has actually happened over the last 40 years is we have seen a growing failure of economic policy in North Korea. If North Korea were only doing things as badly economically as it did in the 1970s, it would be in vastly better shape than it is today. So, one more thing to show you, to share. What would happen using these data sets? And this is all obviously quite hypothetical, and I'm not going to stake my life on any of this, but just as a thought exercise. What would happen if you took the sorts of information we have in these big data sets about the way that classical, non-reformed socialist economies perform, the way that reform economies like Vietnam and China perform under reform socialism, and the way that post-socialist economies perform? Well, if you go through these numbers that I was playing with, you see that It's worse to be a classical socialist economy. It's a little better to be a reform socialist economy. It's better still to be a post-socialist economy. The best of all is to never have been socialist, as far as all of these results are concerned. But I go through and I show what would happen if in 2010, with the level of urbanization and health and education that we think North Korea may have had in 2010, what would North Korea's export performance, import performance, and GDP per capita look like? Well, as a classical socialist state, by these numbers, the income would be about $2,000 a person. As a post-socialist state, almost $5,000 a person. Both of those figures are a lot higher than anything you hear quoted by the Bank of Korea, not that I'd stake my life on that number either. As a classical socialist economy, North Korea would be earning about 5 or 7 times as much in the way of export revenues as it's doing today. As a post-socialist economy, about 15 times beyond that. Same with service exports, same with service imports. I'm not detailing all of the particular policy deformations that North Korea is afflicted with today. This just gives you a general impression. And so the conclusion I have here is that what's happened to North Korea in the last 20 years and even in the last 40 years is not that difficult to explain if you try to put North Korea back into the human family. Any country with the awful and deteriorating set of policy environment problems that North Korea has had would do the same. North Korea's human resources are not so bad, at least to go by the books. But the policy environment in which those have been put to use has gotten gradually worse and worse and worse. For much of this period, that is the story of the rise of Kim Jong-il. Now it is the story of Kim Jong-un. I'll stop there, and I'm happy to chat about any aspect of this that you'd care to.
Sure. Let me ask you a few things, and then we'll turn to the studio audience. So, I mean, in some ways, an extreme question to this is, why is it even there still existing? I mean, what is it like Zimbabwe and North Korea? Is it a China factor? Other types of external injections that really account for this?
Well, of course, I can't explain why the North Korean government still exists. As you know, back in the 1990s, I thought it was on a path for economic collapse, for basic breakdown in the division of labor. I think it came fairly close to that, but that didn't happen. In economic terms, I think the reason that North Korea still exists is because the state has displayed a positive genius for aid-seeking stratagems. And now this is not unique to North Korea. If you go back and read about South Korea in the 1950s and very, very early 1960s, economists talk about the brilliant aid-seeking stratagems that the Syngman Rhee government used and so forth, with gaming the United States, Eisenhower's fury about pouring money down the rat hole and so forth. But North Korea has brought this to a real master art. Wasn't just gaming the Soviet Union and China during the Cold War days. It has been, of course, tapping the United States in the post-Cold War period, tapping South Korea in the post-Cold War period, and Japan, and most recently, somehow, unlocking a treasure trove of aid from China in the period since the six-party talks began. At this point in time, North Korea appears to be more absolutely and totally dependent upon Chinese largesse than it ever was on the economic beneficence of any single state in the pre-six-party period of its history. So that may explain the wherewithal, the outside resources that are keeping the operation going, why there hasn't been a coup, why there hasn't been an uprising, why there haven't been other sorts of political disruptions, I can't tell you.
Mm-hmm. And in framing this, I guess, against some of the former Soviet Union realities, a year ago this time, Charles Armstrong was here with the release of his book, Tyranny of the Weak. And one of the things he discovered as he went through much of the declassified information at the Woodrow Wilson Center from some former communist systems was there was actually communication that they felt that North Korea was in a much worse situation than they ever publicly revealed. And so I guess that also begs into the question then, how were they able to maintain this facade or whatever you'd like to describe it as, and how does I guess to look forward, how does it look in terms of another area of your expertise, which is analyzing Russia, for example, and sort of post-socialist realities, and what could be ways forward, if any, or there isn't out of this sort of economic model?
Well, I mean, I think that the work that Charles has done on looking at the archival data and the archival data that's been gathered at the Woodrow Wilson Institute's Cold War History Project and materials like that are absolutely invaluable in trying to understand the origins of the North Korean state and thus the origins of the North Korean economic problem that we see today. I mean, one of the things which is fascinating to note, for example, is not just how worried some of the embassy people and other Soviet bloc officials are about DPRK economic performance, but how infuriated they are by the recurring fact that the North Korean government never, ever, ever repays its debts. I mean, this is not something that suddenly sprang on the international scene when North Korea started to deal with imperialist economies. This goes back to the very beginning of the state. Debts are not meant to be repaid, even to fraternal states. So we see some of the behavior which I think feeds into this accumulating accretion of bad behavior and bad policy environment from very early days. That said, one of the things which I think will astonish younger people in the U.S. or in the ROK is that there was a time when everybody who followed this more or less agreed that North Korea's economy was ahead of the South Korean economy. I'm not saying that the KCIA and the CIA are perfect observers of international events, because we know they're not. But it was consensus view, both in the South Korean and the U.S. intelligence community, that the DPRK was outperforming the ROK until the early or mid-1970s. And so part of what we have to understand is, how did this economy that was, by some measure, in overdrive? I mean, it wasn't until the 1970s that North Korea was surpassed by South Korean trade performance. I mean, how is it that this economy that was in overdrive goes into stall and then goes into this catastrophic downward spiral? And that's, I think, how you link kind of the early archival indications of what the socialist community was seeing with where we are today.
Mm-hmm. Are there models out there then, or where should we be looking? Less China and more former Soviet Union reality?
Well, one of the important comparators, of course, is South Korea. I mean, you couldn't have a population that's any more similar to the North Korean population than the population partitioned in the South, even though there are many big differences today between the two. I think it's worthwhile to go back and look at what happened with South Korean economic development. As I already mentioned, in the 1950s, American aid officials were driven to fury by the South Korean counterparts that they had to deal with. They thought, and they may have been correct, that South Korean officialdom would deliberately tinker with the economy to engender crises just to get more aid from the United States. Eisenhower famously talked about pouring money down a rat hole, the rat hole being the Republic of Korea. When President Kennedy came to office, he determined that there would be a new American approach to aid to South Korea. And he sent his new head of USAID, which was the new name for the American Foreign Aid Administration, to Seoul to tell the Park Geun-hye government that the United States was cutting off aid to South Korea. They weren't going to do it tomorrow. It was going to be a very gradual process to eliminate dislocations, but it was inexorable, and it would be gradually accomplished. Now, you can understand that for a government that depended so much for its operations on American aid, this brought about a sort of a panic in policy circles. And the question was, how could the government survive? One thing led to another, and the South Korean official answer to the prospective cutoff of American aid was export-oriented growth, which is more or less the same story as had occurred in Taiwan a few years earlier. We know what happened with export-oriented growth. We know where South Korea is today, member of the OECD. It's not a it's not a Horatio Alger story, but it is a remarkable story with all of its flaws entailed. It didn't have to work that way, but the prospect of losing the aid led South Korean decision makers to embark upon a process which led to fantastically impressive material advance for decade after decade after decade. It's a very instructive tale, and it's a tale that people might want to tell to policymakers in China or elsewhere if they wanted to think about actual reform in North Korea rather than the continuation of more ghastly but more perfected aid-maximizing stratagems in DPRK.
Thank you, Nick. I'm afraid that's where we're going to have to leave the discussion. We really appreciate your taking the time today and really giving us this very comprehensive overview, and also provide an opportunity here for a few minutes in case members of our audience would like to come up and say hi if you have any further questions for Nicholas Eberstadt. But please join me in thanking Nicholas Eberstadt for his
Thank you.
presentation. Thank you, Nick.
Thank you.